There are things in the kitchen that look harmless. The microwave, a pot of yesterday's rice, last night's spinach in the pan, the oil that did not get used up. None of these look like a health decision. But for four specific foods, what happens when they heat a second time is a question the food chemistry and oncology research communities have been asking carefully for decades. Most people have been reheating leftovers their entire lives without giving it a second thought. Microwave, stovetop, oven, whatever's fastest, and move on with the day. For the majority of foods, that is perfectly fine. But there is a small, specific category of foods where reheating does something chemically real and measurable, something the food safety and oncology research communities have been documenting for decades, and that most people have never been told before anything else. A quick and important note. This channel covers general education, not medical advice, and I am not your doctor. Nothing here is a diagnosis, a treatment recommendation, or a guarantee against cancer. Cancer is a complex, multifactorial disease, and the relationship between food preparation and cancer risk is one of probability and accumulation over a lifetime, not a single meal causing a single outcome. I will be precise about what the research does and does not show, and I will not overstate it. With that said, tell me your age in the comments right now and which of these foods you regularly reheat. I read them. Stay through food number 2. It is the one sitting in most people's refrigerators right now, and the chemistry of what happens to it when it is reheated is genuinely worth understanding. Let us go through all 4, starting with the least critical and counting down to the most important. Before we get to the 4 foods, let me explain the underlying chemistry that connects them, because understanding the mechanism is what makes this information stick rather than become another list you forget by tomorrow. When certain foods are reheated, one of 3 chemical processes can occur, depending on the food's composition. The first is nitrosamine formation. Certain foods that are high in nitrates or nitrites, either naturally occurring or added as preservatives, can, when heated repeatedly at high temperatures, convert those compounds into N-nitrosamines. Nitrosamines are a class of chemical compounds that have been classified as probable or possible carcinogens by the International Agency for Research on Cancer. The conversion is not automatic. It requires specific conditions: the presence of nitrites or nitrates, a protein environment, elevated temperature, and often an acidic pH. Not every reheating event produces a meaningful quantity of nitrosamines, but repeated reheating of the same food amplifies the exposure over time. The second process is the degradation of certain fats under heat. When polyunsaturated fatty acids, the kind found in plant oils, fish, and some protein-rich foods, are exposed to high heat repeatedly, they oxidize. Lipid oxidation produces a range of compounds including aldehydes, peroxides, and advanced glycation end products that have been associated with cellular inflammation and oxidative stress in the research literature. The third process is protein degradation under high temperature reheating, which can produce heterocyclic amines, so compounds formed when amino acids and creatine react at high temperatures that have been classified as possible carcinogens by the IARC. So these are the 3 chemical pathways. The 4 foods on this list each fall into one or more of them, and understanding which pathway applies to which food tells you both why the risk exists and how to practically reduce it. The governing principle here is not fear. It is chemistry. Knowing the chemistry gives you control over the exposure, and I want to be direct about one more thing before we go to the 4 foods. The title of this video uses the word never, and in most cases, that word is too absolute for the nuanced reality the research describes. What the evidence actually supports is closer to these 4 foods, under these specific conditions of reheating, produce chemical changes that meaningfully and unnecessarily increase cumulative exposure to compounds associated with cancer risk. Never captures the urgency. The chemistry captures the nuance. What follows gives you the nuance. Food number 4, oils used for frying. specifically when the same oil is reheated and reused for multiple cooking sessions. This is less about a specific food and more about the cooking medium, but it belongs on this list because it is one of the most consistently documented sources of harmful reheating chemistry in the food science literature, and it is one that home cooks replicate without realizing it. When a polyunsaturated oil, sunflower oil, corn oil, soybean oil, or any highly unsaturated cooking oil is heated to frying temperature once, it begins to undergo lipid peroxidation. Some of the unsaturated fatty acids break down into aldehydes, including acrolein, 4-hydroxynonenal, and melandialdehyde. These aldehydes are reactive compounds. They are capable of forming bonds with cellular proteins and DNA, and several have been classified as possible or probable carcinogens by regulatory authorities. A study published in the journal Food Chemistry examined the aldehyde content of oils heated to frying temperature across multiple sessions and found that aldehyde production increased substantially with each successive heating. The second and third heating events produced far more aldehydes than the first, because the already degraded fatty acids became more susceptible to further oxidation with each cycle. The practical implication, frying oil that has been heated, cooled, and reheated for a second frying session has a measurably different and more chemically reactive composition than fresh oil. The stale, acrid smell of old frying oil is partly the smell of these aldehydes making themselves known. For home cooks, food chemists recommend using a more thermally stable fat for high-heat cooking. Refined avocado oil, refined coconut oil, or clarified butter have higher smoke points and significantly greater resistance to oxidative degradation, and not reusing oil from a prior frying session. The risk is not from a single use of a standard cooking oil. It is from the repeated reheating of already degraded fat, session after session, week after week, producing cumulative aldehyde exposure that adds to the body's total oxidative burden. There is a broader food environment dimension worth naming here. Commercial deep fryers in restaurant settings often use the same oil through dozens of heating cycles before it is replaced, producing concentrations of oxidative products that are measurably higher than anything achievable in a home kitchen with a single reuse. The research on aldehyde exposure from restaurant-fried foods, particularly from establishments with high-volume, high-frequency fryer operation, is a consistent thread in the environmental exposure literature on dietary carcinogens. The home kitchen version of this problem is a scaled-down but mechanistically identical version of the same chemistry. Whether the source is a restaurant fryer on its 30th cycle or a home pan with oil from last night's cooking, the direction of the chemistry is the same, only the magnitude differs. Food number 3. Processed meats, specifically luncheon meats, sausages, hot dogs, and cured meats that contain sodium nitrite as a preservative. This one has a larger and more established evidence base than most people realize, and the reheating element adds a specific and important dimension to a risk that exists even without it. The World Health Organization's International Agency for Research on Cancer classified processed meat as a Group 1 carcinogen in 2015, meaning the evidence that processed meat consumption increases the risk of colorectal cancer was considered sufficient and consistent across multiple independent lines of research. The mechanism most directly implicated is N-nitrosamine formation. The sodium nitrite used to preserve and color processed meats converts to nitrous acid in an acidic environment, which then reacts with secondary amines from the meat's protein content to form N-nitrosamines. This reaction occurs during initial cooking, but it is significantly accelerated by high-temperature reheating. A leftover hot dog or sausage reheated at high temperature in a pan or microwave is producing more nitrosamines than the same product consumed cold or only gently warmed. The research does not suggest that a single reheated sausage at a birthday party causes cancer. That is not how the evidence works, and framing it that way would be dishonest. What the research does support is that the cumulative exposure to N-nitrosamines over a lifetime is a meaningful contributor to colorectal cancer risk, and that unnecessary high-temperature reheating of nitrite-preserved meats adds to that cumulative exposure without adding anything nutritionally. For those who eat processed meats regularly, consuming them as close to their original preparation state as possible, cold from the package or only gently warmed, is the more cautious approach the evidence supports. There is one more nuance worth naming, because I do not want the IARC Group 1 classification to create more fear than the evidence warrants. Group 1 means the evidence of carcinogenicity is sufficient. It does not mean the risk is large in absolute terms. The IARC estimated that 50 grams of processed meat per day, roughly 2 slices of bacon or 1 hot dog, is associated with approximately an 18% increase in relative risk of colorectal cancer. For a person whose baseline lifetime risk of colorectal cancer is roughly 5%, an 18% relative increase produces an absolute risk of approximately 5.9%. That is a real increase. It is not a catastrophic one. The honest framing is, the risk from processed meat is real, it is dose-dependent, and it is meaningfully influenced by preparation method. Reducing reheating and reducing overall frequency are both rational, proportionate responses. Neither of them means never eating a hot dog at a baseball game. Type the number 3 in the comments if processed meat is a regular part of your household's diet. Food number 2. This is the one I told you to wait for. Rice, and specifically, cooked rice that has been left at room temperature for more than a brief window before being reheated. The cancer-related chemistry here is more indirect than the nitrosamine pathway, but the food safety risk attached to improperly stored and reheated rice is one of the most consistently underestimated hazards in the domestic kitchen, and the chronic inflammation dimension is worth understanding clearly. Cooked rice, when left at room temperature, provides near-ideal conditions for the growth of a bacterium called Bacillus cereus. Bacillus cereus produces spores that survive normal boiling temperatures. Cooking kills the active bacteria but not the spores, and as the rice cools and sits at room temperature, those spores germinate into active bacteria that produce 2 distinct types of toxins: an emetic toxin causing vomiting within 1 to 5 hours of consumption, and a diarrheal toxin produced after ingestion in the intestinal tract. Critically, neither toxin is destroyed by reheating. They are heat-stable proteins. Reheating rice that has been contaminated through improper storage kills the bacteria present at that moment, but leaves the toxins fully intact and active. Repeated episodes of foodborne toxin exposure produce a repeating cycle of gut lining inflammation, mucosal irritation, immune activation, and oxidative stress at the intestinal lining. The gastroenterology literature has associated chronic gut inflammation and intestinal permeability, when sustained over years, with elevated colorectal cancer risk through pathways involving chronic NF-kappa B activation and sustained mucosal immune response. That is a more indirect connection than the nitrosamine chemistry, and I want to be explicit about that degree of separation. The direct food poisoning risk from improperly stored rice is independently and well established. The UK Food Standards Agency has identified improperly stored cooked rice as one of the most common sources of domestic food poisoning in home kitchens. The correct practice is specific and simple. Cool cooked rice rapidly. Within an hour of cooking, refrigerate it immediately, store it for no more than 1 day, and when reheating, bring it to 165 degrees Fahrenheit throughout and consume it immediately. Never reheat the same rice twice. The cumulative gut lining argument is the long-term case for getting this right. The acute food safety case speaks for itself. And I want to add one piece of practical detail that most food safety discussions on rice leave out. The danger window for Bacillus cereus is not just overnight. The bacteria and their toxins can reach concerning levels in cooked rice left at room temperature for as little as 2 hours in warm ambient conditions. The standard food safety guidance from health authorities, including the FDA and the UK Food Standards Agency, defines the danger zone as between 40 and 140 degrees Fahrenheit, and specifies that food should not remain in that range for more than 2 hours in total, counting the cooling time after initial cooking. A pot of rice that takes 45 minutes to cool to room temperature and then sits for another 90 minutes before being refrigerated has already spent most of its safe window. The practical habit that prevents the problem entirely is to portion leftover rice into a shallow container immediately after serving. Shallow containers cool faster, and place it in the refrigerator within 30 minutes of cooking. That habit, maintained consistently, eliminates the bacterial growth window before it opens. Food number 1. The food that food scientists and oncology dietitians discuss most specifically in the context of reheating chemistry, and the one whose mechanism on a second heat is precise enough to be named with confidence in the peer-reviewed literature. Spinach and other leafy greens with high natural nitrate content, including kale, Swiss chard, beet greens, and celery. Spinach sits at the top of this list because it contains some of the highest concentrations of naturally occurring dietary nitrates of any commonly consumed vegetable. This is normally a positive attribute. Dietary nitrates from leafy greens are converted in the body by oral bacteria into nitrites and then into nitric oxide, a signaling molecule that relaxes blood vessel walls, reduces blood pressure, and improves endothelial function. The cardiovascular research on dietary nitrates from vegetables is largely favorable, and leafy greens remain among the most nutritionally valuable foods available. The problem arises under a specific set of conditions, when cooked spinach is allowed to sit, particularly at room temperature, and then subjected to the heat of reheating. Under these conditions, the naturally occurring nitrates in the spinach undergo bacterial conversion to nitrites outside the body, and those nitrites then interact with the protein environment of the dish at reheating temperatures to form N-nitrosamines through the same pathway that applies to processed meats, but via the naturally occurring rather than artificially added nitrate route. A study published in the European Journal of Nutrition examining nitrosamine formation in cooked leafy greens found that nitrosamine content in spinach increased significantly after reheating, with the most pronounced increase occurring when the cooked spinach had been stored at room temperature between initial cooking and reheating rather than refrigerated. The temperature of storage between the two heat exposures is the critical variable. Refrigeration dramatically slows the bacterial conversion of nitrates to nitrites that precedes the nitrosamine-forming reaction at reheating. Cooked spinach left in a covered pan on the stovetop for several hours before being reheated is in a fundamentally different chemical condition than spinach refrigerated immediately and gently rewarmed once. The practical guidance that food scientists consistently offer: cook spinach and other high-nitrate greens and eat them at that meal. If you have leftovers, refrigerate them immediately rather than leaving them at room temperature, and if reheating is necessary, do so once, gently, from refrigerator temperature. Better still, add leftover cooked greens cold to salads, or stir them into hot soup at serving time to wilt rather than cook them a second time. Consider a woman in her mid-70s. Call her someone who had been batch cooking sautéed spinach each Sunday and reheating portions throughout the week, leaving the remaining batch on the counter between uses for convenience. She had been told spinach was among the healthiest foods she could eat, and it is, but no one had told her about the specific chemistry of nitrate-rich greens and room temperature storage before reheating. Once she understood the mechanism, she changed one habit. The batch went straight into the refrigerator after cooking, and she added it cold to her lunches rather than reheating it. Same food, same nutrition, meaningfully different chemical exposure over the course of a week, a month, a year. I want to say something explicit here, because the risk with spinach specifically is easy to misread. Spinach is not a food to avoid. It is one of the most nutritionally dense foods commonly available, rich in folate, magnesium, iron, vitamin K1, and the carotenoids lutein and zeaxanthin that protect the macula of the eye. The cardiovascular benefit of its naturally occurring nitrates, converting to nitric oxide through the normal metabolic pathway, is documented and real. Nothing in this video changes the recommendation that leafy greens belong in a healthy diet every day. What changes is one specific preparation behavior, the sequence of cook, leave at room temperature, then reheat. That specific sequence with that specific food, under those specific conditions, produces a chemistry that the initial benefit does not justify. The food is not the problem. The handling is, and knowing that distinction is precisely what allows you to continue eating spinach as freely as you ever did, with only a minor adjustment to what happens to it between the stove and your plate. Here is the honest picture when all four are held together. Two of them, processed meats and reheated spinach, involve the nitrosamine pathway, nitrites or nitrates converting to carcinogenic N-nitroso compounds under conditions of heat, protein, and time. One, frying oil, involves lipid peroxidation, the progressive degradation of polyunsaturated fats under repeated high heat into reactive aldehydes that interact with cellular structures. And one, rice, involves a microbial and chronic inflammatory pathway that is more indirect but independently documented in food safety and gastroenterology literature. None of these is a verdict. None of them means that decades of occasionally reheating leftovers produces a defined, inevitable cancer outcome. What the research supports is a probabilistic relationship between cumulative exposure and incremental risk elevation, the kind of relationship that is meaningfully influenced by consistent small adjustments in habit rather than dramatic dietary overhauls. Use stable oils and do not reuse frying fat. Eat processed meats cold when possible. Refrigerate cooked rice immediately and reheat it only once to full temperature. Enjoy cooked spinach at the initial meal, or refrigerate it immediately and reheat it once gently, or add it cold to a subsequent meal. These are four small habit changes that, held consistently over years, meaningfully reduce cumulative exposure through pathways the research has characterized with reasonable confidence. The research on dietary cancer risk is genuinely complex, and I want to close by saying something that does not always get said in content like this. The contribution of food preparation choices to overall cancer risk is real, but modest relative to the largest modifiable risk factors: smoking, excess body weight, physical inactivity, alcohol consumption, and the absence of regular cancer screening. The four changes described in this video are worthwhile. They are not the most powerful choices on the table. Getting screened for colorectal cancer, maintaining a healthy weight, limiting alcohol, and not smoking are each individually more consequential than any single dietary preparation habit. These four food habits are the small, consistent, low-effort refinement layer that sits on top of those larger decisions. They are meaningful precisely because they cost almost nothing to implement. Tell me in the comments, which of these four surprised you most? And do you regularly reheat any of them? I read every response, and the answers from this community shape what comes next. If someone you cook for, a family member, a close friend, would benefit from understanding this, share it with them, not as alarm, as the specific, chemistry-grounded version of something they may have heard only vaguely before. Next, I want to walk you through the specific cooking method that research identifies as producing the highest concentration of heterocyclic amines in protein-rich foods, and the simple technique adjustments that reduce that formation by more than 90% without changing what you eat. Watch that one next.